Alara's bare feet scraped against the coarse, sun-baked earth as she stood in the heart of the clan's gathering circle, eyes fixed on the faces twisted in accusation and betrayal. The cruel desert sun spared no mercy, its relentless heat rising from the cracked ground and baking the air around her like a suffocating shroud. Every breath she drew felt tainted by the cold stares, sharp words, and the unspoken verdict that had shattered the fragile remnants of her world. Treason, the clan elder's voice rang out. A grim hammer pounding in the silence. She has betrayed us, siding with enemies who seek to unravel what we have built. His gaze swept the gathering like a judge delivering a death sentence. Alara, you are cast beyond the borders of our lands. You are no longer our sister, you are exile. The words fell like icicles, piercing the fragile skin of her spirit. A faint tremor coursed through her slender frame, but she refused to crumble. Those who had once known her as a daughter of the sands, a fierce and loyal member of the tribe, now scorned her utterly. The faint tribal scar across her left cheek itched with the bitter salt of shame and defiance. Her amber eyes, deep, ancient, and haunted, scoured the crowd one last time, searching for an ally where none existed. She glimpsed nothing but hate and fear, a mirror reflecting her lonely fate. Behind her, the elders gestured sharply, barring her from any plea or explanation. Her words, if spoken, would fall on deaf ears. The verdict was final. With a muted resolve burying the roar inside, she backed away. The desert winds whipping her dark chestnut hair, streaked faintly with silver-like shadows woven from moonlight. Each step beyond the boundary felt like a severing of herself, clan, home, identity, all burned behind her in a haze of desert heat and judgment. The wilderness beyond the cliffs was merciless, a realm of swirling sandstorms, jagged rocks, and scorching days that bled into nights colder than death. Her throat was raw, her limbs weak. Thirst gnawed deep beneath her ribs like a starving beast. Yet she staggered forward, driven by a stubborn ember of hope that she could find shelter, survival, even redemption. Days warped into a blur of agony, her vision thinned to narrow slits, and shadows danced unbidden in the corner of her sight. The desert was a cruel keeper of secrets, as indifferent to her suffering as the stars overhead. It was the wolves who found her first. Riven's scouts were sleek shadows in the dusk, swift and silent as the desert night. They moved with practiced caution, senses honed beyond human limits, detecting weakness and sickness from leagues away. When Alara collapsed among the scrub and shattered stone, the wolves knew to call for their king. She was nearly fading when the pack's lead scout, large silver-grey beast, with eyes like thawed ice, nuzzled her cheek gently, sensing the frailty beneath the sharp, defiant spirit. From a distance, the fortress loomed a mountain of cold stone rising from the desert's edge, guarded by sentinels as relentless as the sun. Inside those walls, Riven waited. He was a man carved from shadow and storm, the alpha king of the kingdom's most formidable shifter pack. His tousled raven-black hair framed a face, sharp and unyielding, and beneath piercing ice-blue eyes lay the weight of countless battles won and lost. The jagged scar upon his neck spoke of past wounds endured and dominion claimed, a silent testament to the beast lurking beneath his human skin. When the scouts returned, carrying Alara wounded and near death, the fortress trembled with uneasy tension. Whispers rolled through the stone corridors. Who was this woman? Why had the Alpha's pack brought her here? Riven's wolf stirred restlessly within, a shadow in his mind that howled at the confusing pull from his prisoner's presence. Yet, as he watched Alara from the shadows, the expected fear did not materialize. No tremble of submission, no instinct to flee. Instead, There was something else, an enigmatic strength that stirred something primal and inexplicably protective within him. Her presence was a puzzle cast in flame. "Why isn't she afraid?" he growled under his breath one night, pacing the cold stone floors of his keep, muscles taut beneath his dark tunic. The wolves around him, usually agitated by a stranger in their midst, lounged calmly as if soothed by her silent heartbeat. His beast howled its frustration in dreams, clawing against iron bars, pacing cage-like solitude. But Alara, she met his eyes with burning amber, unyielding, her human spirit untouched by his alpha dominance, and that defiance, oddly, gave his wolf no reason to attack. Later, when she still fought against the weakness gnawing at her, tethered to a bed in the fortress's infirmary, Riven stood sentinel beyond the heavy oak door, his piercing gaze fixed on the woman whose fate had become his burden. She stirred slowly, a stirring as much within as without. Each breath was a victory, each movement a reclaiming of self. She winced as the cool air touched her fevered skin and muttered, "Where am I?" The wolf's gate, a deep voice answered, low but steady. Riven stepped inside, the light casting harsh shadows on his rugged face. His presence was imposing, almost a physical force pressing against her. "I don't know who you are," he said plainly, voice rough like gravel, "but you're under my protection as long as you roam these lands." Alara's lips pressed thin in defiance, but something in his tone softened the sting of those words. She did not reply, no ally to turn to, no trust to offer yet. Her amber eyes held a cautious flame, wary and watchful. Days stretched into weeks within the cold stone fortress. The stark halls echoed with the clicking of boots and the whisper of wolves moving unseen, their powerful forms slinking close, yet respecting an unspoken boundary. Alara drew strength from that strange calm, her body healing, her mind sharpening in the shadows of this new world. Riven watched from a distance, confounded by her immunity to his alpha will. His command swept over his pack like a tempest, bending wills and breaking spirits, yet Alara stood unbowed, a steadfast island in a churning sea of dominance. In the great hall, where the heavy torches sputtered and the scent of old stone mingled with leather and fur, the two collided in moments fraught with tension. "You defy every law of this pack," he said, his voice hard yet tinged with curiosity, narrowing those piercing blue eyes. "Your silence, your resistance, it should break you." But she met his gaze without flicker of fear. "You mistake resistance for weakness," she said softly, the tribal scar twitching with her sharp intake of breath. "I am not afraid of you, Riven." "Nor your beast," he bristled at the use of his name, intimate, dangerous. But something in her tone was not challenge alone. It hinted at a deeper steel, a fire he could neither touch nor tame. Their forced proximity grew unbearable in the silent spaces between words. Every glance, every brush past in the cold corridors was charged with unsaid truths and simmering wariness. Alara could feel the pull of the pack, the raw power seething just beneath the surface of those stone walls. Yet it did not claw at her mind as it did others. That only deepened the enigma and the wild curiosity burning behind her defiance. "You don't fear me," Riven admitted one night, voice low, almost grudging. He stood near the window, gazing out at the desert sands that stretched to the horizon, a world as hostile as the accusations that had cast her out. "Most do. I have other battles," she replied, voice hoarse but steady, "and I've learned that fear is a luxury I cannot afford." The air between them thickened, woven with tension, and the ghosts of past betrayals neither fully understood. As dawn crept over the desert, painting the fortress walls in stubborn hues of gold and crimson, The Alpha King, his beast howling against the silence, found himself bound by a strange and unspoken tether. Alara, the exile with eyes like the burning desert sun, was no prey to fear. And in her presence, the fiercest wolf within Riven's pack grew restless, not from hunger or threat, but from a tugging unknown, a force beyond Alpha, commands and ancient laws. For the first time in countless moons, the Alpha King wondered if his greatest challenge lay not beyond his kingdom's borders, but in the woman who had left his gate with her defiant spirit unbroken, and, with it his beast howling till dawn. The truth had crept to her like a desert wind, subtle, insistent, carrying whispers of betrayal that stung sharper than any wound. Alara sat beneath the gnarled branches of a withered tree at the edge of the Alpha's territory, the sun waning, casting long shadows across cracked earth. Her hands trembled slightly, brushing over the brittle leaves as the realization settled, like a weight pressing against her chest. She had not been cast out for crimes she committed. No, the chains that bound her to exile had been forged by lies, woven by a jealous rival whose venom had slipped into the ears of the clans, poisoning them with deceit. She thought of the day she'd been dragged from the village gates, the stairs filled with betrayal, the harsh accusations slashing her like knives. That cruel moment had swallowed her whole. She had felt fractured, unmoored from the world she thought she understood. But now, faced with the truth, rage and sorrow coiled inside her, a tempest of fire and ice. Someone had sought to burn her away, to claim favor with the clans by sacrificing her, and yet, still alive, she endured. Her mind turned as she looked down at the small figure cradled in her lap. The pup was barely more than a wisp of fur and bone, its snout streaked with dried crimson. Riven's youngest, hurt in a skirmish with a rival pack, brought to her in secret hours by one of the more loyal but wary wolves in the shadowed corners of the fortress. Nursing the fragile life stirred something deep within her, an echo of care she thought long buried, alongside the shattered parts of herself. The bundle shivered against her warmth, eyes blinking weakly in the waning light. She wrapped her fingers gently around the pup's tiny body, pressing soft cloth soaked in herbs to its wound. Outside, the low rumble of the pack's unrest meandered through the stones, heavy with suspicion and silent grudges. Yet, here, in this quiet act, a small innocence bloomed. Every time the pup whimpered, her heartbeat faltered. A soft thrum of vulnerability that contrasted greatly with the harshness of the world outside. She felt her own body growing stronger with each day spent in this land of shifting sands and shifting loyalties, her muscles no longer aching from flight, but from action, from healing. Her spirit, too, hardened into something sharper, clearer, tempered steel against the cold indifference of exile. From the fortress window above, Riven watched. His presence had become a constant, a shadow hanging just beyond reach. His eyes, cold, piercing, tracked her movements with an intensity that was equal parts curiosity and something darker, more guarded. She could feel his gaze like an invisible thread, tugging at the perimeter of her awareness, stirring the beast within the pack, yet never breaching the distance he maintained. There was a flicker in his gaze, a subtle fracture in the Alpha's armor, a concealed turmoil that no warrior of his caliber would easily reveal. It unsettled her, though she wasn't certain why. Was it guilt, regret, or a grudging acknowledgement of the fragility beneath his sovereign strength? One evening, as twilight draped the fortress in muted blues and greys, Riven approached. His shadow fell long across the courtyard, where Alara sat on a stone bench, the pup nestled in her lap, breathing shallow but steady. "You knew, didn't you?" he said abruptly, his voice low and rough like gravel caught in a storm. Alara's gaze lifted to meet his amber eyes steady. Knew what? That you were framed. That this exile was a lie. Her fingers tightened briefly around the warmth of the small life in her hands. I suspected, she said softly, but I didn't have proof. The alpha's jagged wound glinted faintly beneath the fading light, a silent echo of battles fought and scars endured. He crouched beside her, closer than before, and the pack's restless murmur dipped into silence, as if waiting. I had my suspicions too, Riven admitted, but admitting it means questioning the very foundation of the clans. And I? His voice faltered, raw with unspoken pain. I cannot afford weakness. Not now. She searched his expression, reading the conflict etched into every line, every hardened plane of his face. For all his power and command, he was trapped by honor, bound by ancient codes as tightly as she was by her scars. I'm not your enemy, she whispered, and neither is the truth. It's what can save us both. For a moment, the fortress seemed to hold its breath, the desert winds stilling as if the earth itself waited. Later, with the dawn bleeding its pink and gold over the horizon, Alara's attention turned back to the pup, whose body had begun to respond to her ministrations. The faint pulse beneath the ragged fur grew steadier, and with it, so too did something in her, a tentative hope woven from tenderness and resilience. The pack, once aloof and harsh, began to shift. Wolves approached with cautious glances, fewer eyes held open disdain, their snarls became murmurs, their growls softened, and slowly, brick by stone brick, a fragile bridge was laid. From the shadows, she felt the pull of acceptance glimpse a possibility, and through it all, Riven's gaze lingered, cold and unreadable, yet with sparks of something unspoken uncertainty, perhaps. A flicker of something like reluctant respect. The days that followed brought a test unlike any other. Riven summoned her to the cavernous hall where the pack gathered, a space carved from stone and steeped in ritual. The air was thick with anticipation, taut with whispered challenges and quiet judgment. He approached, Alpha's presence like a storm, ready to break. Immunity, he said, voice deep and commanding, is a gift few possess, but a challenge I must exact. Alara's heart thrummed, eyes fixed on the man whose word could bend the wills of beasts. She knew what was coming, his alpha roar, the primal call that bent shifters to their leader's will. For centuries it had forged obedience and fear alike. He drew in a breath, muscles tensed, the scars on his neck flexing beneath his skin as a raw, guttural cry tore from his throat, wild, unrelenting, a summons from the depths of his soul. The hall seemed to pulse with the echo, the pack lifting heads in acknowledgement, their bodies bristling with primal energy, eyes locked on Alara, watching, waiting for the inevitable collapse of her defenses, but she stood unshaken. The roar swept over her like a desert storm, harsh, relentless, yet she planted her feet, firmly chin lifted, amber eyes blazing with defiance. Silence rippled through the hall. The pack's murmurs hushed into tension, disbelief etched on every snout, in every furrowed brow. Riven's ice-blue gaze sharpened, intrigued and unsettled by her rare refusal. The beast within him stirred, a wild, feral hunger mingled with confusion. He had never known resistance like this, not in his mate, nor in his fiercest challengers. Slowly, without command, the pack began to shift. Their primal instincts, trained to obey the alpha's call, bucked against this anomaly. Instead of closing in with submission or aggression, a protective ring formed around her. Fierce eyes gleamed in the shadows, fangs bared not, in defiance of her, but in warning to others. Alara felt the weight of their collective vigilance, the heat of their raw, untamed power crawling over her skin. Her breath hitched, a swirl of fear, fascination, and something dangerously close to exhilaration tightening in her chest, in that living, breathing circle of wild hearts and sharp teeth. She stood alone and unforgettable. Riven stepped inside the perimeter, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body, the primal pulse of the king's wild nature thrumming between them. His voice dropped to a rumble, low enough to hush the pack, yet laced with a challenge. "Why don't you break? Why don't you bend?" His gaze locked on hers, the jagged mark on his neck pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat clenched in battle. Alara's reply was a whisper, but it carried weight beyond its softness, "Because I refuse to be tamed by fear." For a moment, the fortress shook, not with the clash of weapons, but with the quiet, impossible promise of something new. The beast inside Riven howled, torn between restraint and desire, as the pack's protective circle tightened around her like armor. Alara's breath brushed against the charged silence, the fragile balance between predator and prey, alpha and exile. In this crucible of wills and wild instincts, the slow-burning bond between two broken souls deepened, unmade and remade beneath the endless desert sky. And as the last light slipped beyond the fortress walls, leaving only the stars to bear witness, both king and exile found themselves bound by a truth that could no longer be ignored. Neither was alone, neither would ever be the same. The flicker of torchlight barely disturbed the shadows etched into the ancient stonework of the fortress's forgotten corridors. Alara's fingers traced the cool, rough walls as she moved, with deliberate quiet, guided by a restless instinct she couldn't yet name, but refused to ignore. Something in the rhythm of the fortress, its sighs, its hidden whispers, was calling her deeper into its belly. Her breath was steady despite the chill that curled along her spine, and the faint scar on her cheek seemed to prick with an almost electric awareness. She rounded a corner and stopped. The wall ahead bore a seam, subtle beneath centuries of dust and neglect, a narrow door carved into the stone itself, almost swallowed whole by the fortress's weight. A small metal ring hung where a handle might have been, worn smooth by time and perhaps by hands like hers long ago. Her pulse quickened as she tested the door. It gave beneath her touch, with a grinding groan that echoed through the hollow space beyond. The air that spilled out was different, stale, musty, but charged with an energy that made the fine hairs rise on her arms. She crossed the threshold into a narrow passageway that stretched into the darkness, the damp stones pressing in like the ribs of a buried beast. Her footsteps were swallowed quickly, replaced by a low hum that seemed to pulse faintly in the cold air, almost in sync with the faint beat of her own heart. At the end of the passage, she found a small chamber, hidden away beneath the fortress's foundation. The room was lined with ancient tapestries, faded and torn, but still hinting at stories lost beneath generations of silence. In the center stood a pedestal cradling a leather-bound tome, cracked and yellowed with age, its binding fragile but intact as if it had been waiting, unread, for her. Her fingers trembled as she brushed the dust from the cover. The book was embossed with symbols she recognized from the scattered tales whispered in the village long before her exile. Sigils tied to the old bloodlines, the kingdom's secret histories buried from prying eyes. And there, on the first page, in sprawling script inked in silver, was a lineage list that made her breath hitch. Names interwoven with her own, names that spoke of ancestry entwined with the Alpha King's bloodline itself, an inheritance she had never suspected, a power long obscured by lies. Alara's heart hammered, not for glory, but for the truths stolen from her by fear and silence. The realization peeled back years of calculated deceit, revealing a web tangled with betrayal. She traced the faded words that told of a bond between the royal line and a hidden force, one that matched the strange, unyielding strength that thrummed within her veins. The same power Riven's pack feared, but which had never truly belonged to their enemies. Her mind spiraled with questions, and a fierce impatience to break the secrecy that had kept her in the shadows. The truth had been silenced, but now it screamed beneath her skin. She would no longer be the broken exile. She would make Riven face what had been buried. The hall outside was silent, save for her shifting breath as she carried the tome close to her chest. When she confronted Riven, the heat in his eyes was volatile, equal parts surprise, anger, and something fragile, like a cracking wall ready to crumble. They stood beneath the fortress's highest watchtower, the wind pulling at their clothes, tugging at the defiance between them. "You lied," she said, voice low but unyielding. "The power I carry, it's in your blood and in mine. We're not enemies. They've erased what connects us, hidden it like a curse." His jaw clenched, every muscle taut beneath his skin. For a beat, the king's stoic mask faltered, the chill slipping from his gaze to reveal raw, haunted vulnerability beneath. "You don't understand," he said, but the words were brittle, cracked by years of burden. "This truth, it's dangerous, not just for you or me, but for the pack." Alara's amber eyes flashed with fire. "Then why keep it from me? Why let me suffer in exile, thought broken and worthless? I'm not your enemy, Riven. I'm your blood, and if we don't face this together, that power will tear us all apart." He looked away, the jagged scar on his neck bared in the fading light, a wound still aching beneath the surface. His voice dropped to a haunted whisper. "The elders forbade it. The council feared the old magic, feared what it could do to order and control. They silenced every thread that tied me to that legacy, and you believed them?" Her words softened, blooming with something unbearable hurt that mingled with hope. "You believed silence was safer than truth?" Riven's breath hitched as if the walls he had built were crumbling, brick by fierce brick, the beasts lurking in the shadows of the fortress. They stirred uneasily, their growls low and warning. They sensed the unraveling beneath the veneer of control, a fracture opening in the bedrock of their history. The old lies were unraveling, and even the wildest of them sensed the storm coming. "You must understand," he finally said, voice thick with conflict, "that protecting the pack has always meant sacrifice. I sacrificed the truth for peace." Alara's hand found his, steady and unyielding. "But you don't have to sacrifice me, Riven, not anymore. We can be stronger together." His ice-blue gaze locked with hers, every unspoken word lingering in the silence between them, sharp and fragile as broken glass. And for the first time, the king's walls cracked enough to let her in. Days passed, and the fragile peace hung beneath the buzzing tension of inevitable change. The council convened in the shadowed war room, their faces hard as stone, draped in the weight of tradition and suspicion. Around the heavy oaken table, Riven's closest advisors spoke in clipped tones, their words edged with fear and distrust. "She's a threat to our order," growled Edric, a grizzled elder with eyes like flint. "That woman Alara, her presence fractures the pack's unity. We cannot allow this infection to spread." Another voice joined, softer but no less dangerous. "This bloodline revives old pains, old wars. To protect the pack, she must be cast out, once and for all." Riven sat like a mountain, unmoved, the weight of his crown pressing down with every accusation, hurled like poisoned arrows. Inside, the beast roared with instinctual protectiveness, not for the council, not for tradition, but for the exile who had woven herself into his reckoning. The wolf inside him snarled at threats that dared to touch her. When the hall fell silent, the king's voice broke through, a low rumble, edged with ferocity. "No, she stays, not as a threat, but as a shield." Murmurs erupted, a current of unrest swirling like wildfire among the gathered. The council's eyes narrowed, some with grudging respect, others with simmering rage. Loyalty fractured as old alliances shifted, like desert sands, under a fierce wind. "We're not preserving the pack by ruling through fear and lies," Riven declared, his gaze burning steady. "Alara carries our blood. She carries a power that can change everything if we have the strength to embrace it." A tense silence followed, vibrating with the weight of his words. Then, one by one, the murmurs softened, the restless unease folding into cautious hope. The beasts outside paced and growled, sensing the tremors in their leader's soul, attuned to the shift in the Alpha's heart. Alara stood beside Riven, her presence calm and resolute. The scar on her cheek and the silver streaks in her hair marked her as different. But in that moment she was a beacon, steadfast in a storm of uncertainty. Her quiet strength stirred something deep in the pack, a whispered longing for something beyond survival, beyond the old rules. Together, they were no longer just king and exile. They were a new kind of force, raw, unpredictable, and defiant against the looming shadows that sought to tear them apart. The path ahead remained jagged and uncertain, but for the first time, hope glimmered in the darkness, fueled by a bond forged in fire, truth, and the unyielding howl of wolves who refused to be silenced. Blood still seeped from the jagged gash running along the wolf's flank, a dark spreading wound that bled life away with every desperate gasp. The beast lay low against the jagged rocks just beyond the outer rim of the pack's territory, caught in the aftermath of a desperate skirmish. The remnants of the rival shifter faction's ambush still echoed faintly in the distance, the heavy breaths of those who had survived mingling with the scent of crushed earth and splintered wood. Alara moved cautiously toward the injured creature, her heart a tempest tight with both fear and determination. The wolf's amber eyes, wild and feral, flickered with a spark of recognition, or maybe it was defiance. It was hard to tell with shifters in their animal forms. Instinct could simmer between moments of clarity, but she knew the stakes all too well. Every failure to heal, every hesitation would mean death, not just for the wolf beneath her hands, but for the fragile trust that hung between her and this pack. Her fingers were steady, reassuring, an extension of something deeper inside her that was rising to meet the challenge. She reached out gently, long nails brushing over bone and sinew, the warmth in her palms beginning to bloom like slow-burning fire against chilled flesh. This was no ordinary healing. It was a communion with the wild energy of the pack, a silent promise whispered beneath the rise and fall of her breath. The wound pulsed, dark and angry. Alara traced the edges, slowly, sensing the thread of pain within it, the frayed path of broken muscle and punctured skin. The natural bitter scent of blood mixed with the sweet resin of pine from the surrounding forest, anchoring her to the present, grounding her when panic threatened to overwhelm. She closed her eyes, feeling the scar along her cheek thrum in resonance, an echo of the pain and resilience that defined both her body and soul. Slowly she conjured the delicate tendrils of her power, weaving them through the wound like an unseen artisan stitching together something torn. The heat radiated outward, softening the ragged edges, knitting the flesh bit by bit. The wolf twitched, a low whimper escaping its muzzle, but it did not flee. It did not bite or snap. Instead, it seemed to sense the fragile thread of mercy extending toward it through Alara's touch, breaking through the feral storm. Nearby, the pack watched in tense silence, their instincts on a razor's edge between suspicion and awe. Riven stood at the edge of the gathering like an immovable sentinel, his eyes sharp and intense, fierce blue, burning beneath his heavy brows. He had always been cautious of Alara's influence, both because of the pack's doubts and his own stubborn pride. But tonight, he could no longer deny what was unfolding before him. The wolf's breathing eased, the shallow gasps growing slower, more measured. The wound's harsh edges began to fade, the raw redness dulling beneath Alara's hands. It took time longer than many would expect from a swift healer, but the method was different. Every deliberate movement was more than medicine. It was a covenant between predator and protector, weaving an invisible bond. From the corner of his eye, Riven caught the subtle shift in the great beast's posture. The snarls and flinches softened into something almost like gratitude. The wolf's gaze flicked toward Alara, not as a threat, but with the flicker of trust. The very essence of the pack, the alpha's beast within Riven himself, stirred at the edges of that moment. A silent acknowledgement that she was not merely an outsider, but something vital, something needed. He stepped forward, his voice low but commanding, cutting through the murmurs of astonishment. "She's healing him faster than any of us could," Riven said, his tone edged with both pride and an unfamiliar respect. "Take note, this is not weakness. This is power." Alara opened her eyes, their deep amber gleaming under the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. "He's not out of danger," she murmured, voice steady but softened with an undercurrent of compassion. "But if he can hold on a little longer, he'll make it." The pack exhaled collectively, the tension in the air lifting like a heavy fog. The beast at her feet, once on the brink of death, lifted his head, nostrils flaring, as if sensing the unspoken acceptance binding her closer to their world. Riven's beast within, a shadow shifting beneath human form, relaxed its rigid stance for the first time in weeks, allowing Alara to step nearer, a boundary crossed that no one had dared before. Trust was not freely given, it was built, brick by brick, in moments like these. And tonight, the walls between her and the pack, between her and Riven, grew thinner. Dawn had barely begun painting the sky when the distant war cries shattered the brittle calm. The rival faction, those who had never accepted Alara's return, nor Riven's declaration, had come flooding back, their fury a tempest crashing toward the fortress like lightning tearing through a quiet forest. The ground trembled beneath the pounding of feet and the roar of weapons. Riven's gaze snapped to the horizon, his muscles coiled and ready. But his eyes found Alara before he could move, wild and probing, seeking a signal from the woman who had become the unexpected pillar of his strength. The threat wasn't just to the fortress, it was aimed at her, a deliberate provocation meant to fracture his resolve. "We need to hold them off," Riven gritted out, sharp as the blade strapped to his side. "Keep her safe." Alara's pulse hammered in her chest, but a fierce kindling of defiance flared within her. No longer the broken exile, no longer a pawn to their grudges, she stepped forward with a quiet steadiness that caught even the most battle-hardened soldiers off guard. "Let me help," she said simply, her voice clear and unwavering. "They are injured. I can save them." Few met her offer with anything but suspicion. Trust was still fragile, especially in times of war. Yet in that moment, the walls of the fortress were breached by screams and the clash of steel, forcing them to make hard choices. Alara moved swiftly through the chaos, weaving between snarling wolves and rival shifters alike as she found those who had fallen. Her hands worked miracles, bathing wounds in warmth and stitching flesh with threads of golden light that only she could conjure. The air around her shimmered faintly, the scent of healing herbs mingling with the musk of blood and sweat. One by one, broken bodies stirred beneath her touch. A young warrior, whose leg hung at an impossible angle, found strength enough to bite through pain. A mother bear nurse whose shoulder was shattered smiled weakly, soothed by the steady rise and fall of Alara's healing aura. The fortress walls were tested with fierce intensity, but within the chaos, Alara became an unlikely beacon and outcast who healed, who saved, who stood defiantly against the shadows of hatred. Riven watched from the ramparts, his heart pounding fiercely, the jagged mark on his neck burning with a sudden heat. He had known her power was formidable, but now, seeing her moving through the enemy's onslaught like a storm of grace and fire, he understood that her strength was something far larger, far deeper than he ever imagined. There was no fear in her eyes, only the cold clarity of purpose and the fierce compassion of a woman who had scarred too deeply to turn away from pain. As the rival faction faltered, their forces splintering beneath the pack's unified roar, Riven descended from the battlements and met Alara at the fortress's core. Around them, the wounded stirred. Life rekindled where death had once threatened to claim ground. "You're more than a healer," Riven said, voice low and raw with emotion. "You're the storm we never saw coming." Alara's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "I'm not just surviving anymore," she whispered. "I'm fighting for this pack, for us." Whatever comes next, Riven reached out, brushing a stray silver streak from her dark chestnut hair, the unspoken weight between them, a promise forged in battle and healing, settled like a quiet fire, stoked beneath the surface. The beast within him moved closer, a shadow of fur and growth, but this time it stayed, silent and still, accepting her, not as an intruder, but as something essential, something right. Together they stood amidst the ruins of chaos, the dawn now spilling light over the jagged walls, bright and unyielding. Their bond was no longer a secret whispered in shadows, but a force as fierce as the howling wolves that surrounded them, ready to face whatever storms the future dared to bring. The scent of rain hung sharp in the air when Alara stumbled onto the secret whispered in shadows, buried beneath the brittle leaves of a late autumn evening. It was a loose thread, a rumor snagged between heated murmurs in the murky depths of the pack's warehouses, a place where goods from the surrounding wilds came and went, and where no outsider was meant to tread. But Alara had learned how to shadow walk through the pack's underbelly, slipping between looming crates and rust-worn beams as if she were part of the cold stone fortress itself. Her presence was the silent echo that no one noticed at first, until she noticed them, her amber eyes, sharp with the storm of recent battles and the resilience forged in exile, caught the flickers of conversation before bodies did. Two shadowed figures, the lesser lieutenants of the rival Alpha, whose name still burned like a wound in her thoughts. Darek, the words they spilled were a poison she could no longer ignore. "The coup is coming at the next full moon. The Alpha is weakened, and the pack is ripe to fall." There was a harsh urgency, a conspiracy brewing with every syllable. Alara's breath caught, not from fear, but from recognition of the danger. Darek, the man who had orchestrated the ruin of her past, sought to tear down the king she had come to grudgingly honor. She tucked the knowledge into the silent folds of her mind, a secret clasped close like a knife beneath her jacket. She couldn't speak it aloud. To reveal what she knew would mark her as a traitor or a spy and bring ruin in the form of knife and fang. Instead, she carried the burden alone, watching the shifts within the pack with eyes that measured more than just surface loyalty. Days bled into restless nights as whispers began to follow her like a ghost. The pack was sensing the change, the ripples that trailed behind a woman, once cast out, now unyieldingly present in their midst. "Hear her whisper, the storm in human form," the hunters said quietly. "She walks the shadows of the wild and returns with fire in her veins, her strange immunity to Riven's hold his command." Pret, his beast, became a story told in hushed awe and reluctant respect. They did not understand the origins of her power, only that it was real and formidable. Alara felt the shifting tides beneath the pack's skin, currents of fear and fascination mingling in complicated dances. And through it all, Riven's gaze remained a constant storm, wary but tethered, watching her as a king watches a blade forged in the enemy's fire, dangerous, unpredictable, but possibly the sharpest edge he had ever held. His ice-blue eyes locked with hers late one evening, beneath the fractured light of the moon, slicing through the fortress windows. "Why do you carry this weight alone?" he asked, voice low as gravel, burden heavy beneath the question. Alara looked away, amber flaring with the fight she had learned not to share. "Because if I speak, the pack will tear you apart before you have a chance to defend yourself. And you," her voice dropped, thick with the history between them, "you would see me as the enemy all over again." For a long moment, their silence stretched thin. Then he nodded, a quiet concession, the hard knot inside him, loosening just a fraction. "You're not the enemy." "No," she whispered, "but he is still out there." Waiting, weeks passed with tension simmering beneath the surface, and then the edict came down like a thunderclap through the ancient halls of the fortress. Alara was to be exiled beyond the outer perimeters to the sacred hunting ground in the southern wilds. The accusation was veiled, harboring secrets, unknown allegiances, a threat to the pack's stability, yet it felt more like a cage for her than a punishment, a way to push her to the edge and test her resilience. And with a cold grip on his pride, Riven decreed that he would accompany her. Two wolves, bound by the iron law of necessity, were thrust into a cramped, rust-worn guard tower on the fringes of the wild, the cold stone pressing against their backs like judgment. The fire flickered low in the hearth, shadows crawling along the walls as the wind whispered its mournful song outside. Alara sat rigid on the edge of a rough-hewn bench, jaw clenched against the storm of emotions churning within. Riven leaned by the narrow window, his figure a silhouette framed against the bleak, grey stretches of wilderness beyond, muscle taut and eyes somber. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but dense with years of misunderstanding, of broken promises and unspoken words. Finally, she broke it with a voice rough from disuse. "So this is where you exile the insolent?" Riven's lips twitched in a ghost of a smile. "The pack needs to see you punished. But the king needs you alive. Here, not dead in some forgotten thicket." Her gaze flicked to him, fierce and searching. "Then why are you here? For show, or to keep your beast chained?" He met her fire with his own, vulnerable beneath the armor of command. "Neither, because alone you'll break, and I'm not willing to let that happen." Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was rarely, if ever, that Riven so openly admitted concern. Her walls, built brick by brick from years of abandonment, wavered under the weight of his words. Hours crept by as the fire dwindled to embers and the night deepened into a hollow silence. Conversation bled slowly from the edges of restraint, gentle threads unraveling the tapestry of their loneliness. "I was wrong about you," Riven confessed, voice raw with bitter regret. "I judged you by the lies that clung to your name, by the blood that stained your past. But you are not the broken thing I thought you were." Alara traced the faint scar along her cheek, the burn of memory beneath her fingertips. "And you, were you always so sure of yourself?" The unshakable alpha of legend. He let out a humorless chuckle, the sound mingling with the cracking of the fire. "Behind this face is a man who once howled all night, not in anger, but loneliness. The kind of solitude that no pack, no matter how large, can fill." She looked away, her amber eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "I've known that solitude too. It was my only company in the wilds, until I found you, standing where no one thought I'd survive. Neither of us was meant to survive this, Riven said softly. But maybe that's because we were meant to find each other instead. The space between them shifted then, not yet soft or kind, but edged with a fragile something new. A curious tendril of fascination, of tentative trust, of a longing neither dared name aloud. Their conversation carried them through the cold night, peeling back layers of armor forged by isolation, revealing the raw and aching humanity beneath. Riven spoke of the weight of leadership, the crushing expectation of never faltering before a pack that looked to him as their unbreakable pillar. Alara shared the ache of a past enslaved by betrayal, the sharp sting of exile that had twisted her from a woman into a survivor. "I didn't come to you for shelter," she whispered. "I came because I believed the beast inside you might understand the storm within me." His eyes shone with a fierce but gentle light in the darkness. "The beast in me stopped howling when it found you standing at my gate." For a long time, they sat in the quiet company of flickering flames and their own breath, not quite touching, but no longer worlds apart. Outside, the forest sighed beneath the moon's watchful gaze, ancient and indifferent to the fragile burgeoning bond, locked within the stone walls of their exile. They were trapped, two halves bruised and weary, but in that shared confinement, they found not just survival, but the stirring of something impossible to name. Something that, for the first time in years, promised the possibility of belonging. Alara rolled her shoulders, releasing tension she hadn't realized had seized her. She looked at Riven, the jagged scar on his neck catching the firelight in a brutal, honest way. "What happens when we return? When the pack sees us? Like this?" Riven's jaw clenched, a flicker of the Altha's fierce protectiveness blazing in those piercing blue eyes. "Then I will stand with you, not as king to subject, but as man to woman." A small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "You make a convincing liar, and you," he shot back, "make a compelling queen." The room was no longer cold, and the wilds beyond no longer seemed so threatening. For one brief, perfect moment, together, they faced the unknown dawn, fierce hearts beating against the silence, two shattered souls beginning to weave something new, and fiercely, undeniably, theirs. The cold bite of dawn had barely begun to fade when Alara slipped silently from the shelter of the Altha King's camp and into the thick, greening wilderness beyond. The scent of damp earth, pine resin and wildflowers mingled with the faint metallic tang of underlying danger that clung to these forests like a second skin. She moved with careful purpose, each step measured not only by the need to remain unseen, but by the fierce determination kindling within her. For weeks she had watched, learned, and sensed something impossible, amidst the tangled alliances and bitter rivalries stretching across the shifting borders of Riven's domain, an invisible cage forged from centuries of grievances and broken trusts. The clans surrounding the king's territory were volatile, their lungs filled with old hatred and suspicion like smoke waiting to flare and consume. Normally, even Riven's overwhelming command is raw, that bent lesser wills to his iron will, could never tame them. But Alara, with her strange immunity to his shifter power, had become something more than a weapon or a warder. She was becoming the bridge they needed, a compass in a broken world. At least, she hoped so. She found the first hostile camp at the edge of the jagged ridges, a cluster of shadowed tents and wary eyes. The tribe was known for its fierce warriors and a grudge against Riven's pack, steeped deep in blood, spilled long before either of them had drawn breath. They called themselves the Saren, their skin marked with blue and black swirls, mimicking the thunderclouds that stalked the highlands. Their alpha, a burly man named Lorin, stood apart from the others, eyes narrowed to slits, arms crossed like iron bars over his broad chest. "Your footprints are too fresh," Lauren said sharply, voice low like gravel scraping stone. "If you had any sense, you wouldn't be here at all." Alara met his gaze steadily, feeling the stir of something wild and ancient beneath the surface of his scowl. "I do not come as a spy or a thief." Her voice was calm, even though a part of her clenched at the sharp scrutiny. "To negotiate," Lauren snorted, but did not signal his men forward. "Negotiations are for the weak. Your king's claws run deep into these lands, and you come asking for peace? Not peace alone," she said, stepping forward into the circle of dull sun, filtering through the sheltering boughs, understanding. The kind of peace that holds only when both sides know the price of war. The air hung taut, expectant, as if the forest itself was leaning forward to catch the next words. Alara's amber eyes flicked to the emblem on her chest. A mark riven had pressed into her skin, symbol of the pack's claim, and now her claim too. The Saran had heard the stories, seen the scars, but what they did not understand was that her immunity to Riven's call meant she was not a weapon, not a pawn to be wielded blindly. She was a partner, a new kind of power in the relentless sprawl of savage ambition. Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. "You walk where others fear to tread. What promise do you make for the risk we take hearing you?" "I promise nothing easy," she said, heartbeat steady, despite the tension wrapping tight like vines. "But I promise honesty and courage. The kind shared only by those who have faced the darkness together." For long moments, no one spoke. Then slowly, a subtle shift rippled through the gathering. One by one, weapons lowered incrementally, and Lauren's stern expression softened, just enough to expose the slightest flicker of reluctant respect. "You have my attention, woman with the silver streaks." The days that followed wove the fragile beginnings of diplomacy through whispered words and cautious meetings. Alara's gift, or curse, depending on the moment, was that she felt nothing of the primal pull that roared through the shifters, the dominating force Riven wielded without thought. To others that power was an invisible chain or a lash, but to her it was silence, a sacred space in which she could see the true shape of things beneath the snarls and protests. Riven watched from the shadows, the beast within him, stirring restlessly. It was the first time in his 35 years that his roar had lost its edge, not because it faltered, but because it sought something unfamiliar: peace. He found himself listening, more than ordering, observing her ease amid dangers he could barely control. The Alpha's power was a tempest, but Alara was like the calm eye at its center, and instead of crushing those angry winds, she was guiding them, turning wild menace into potential allies. One evening, as twilight bled into the mournful chorus of night, Riven joined her at the edge of an ancient stone circle where leaders from rival clans gathered reluctantly. The campfire flared between them, shadows dancing like restless spirits. "Your presence unsettles them," Riven muttered, ice-blue eyes locked on Alara's calm amber ones. She smiled softly, the faint tribal scar on her cheek catching the dying light. "That is the point. They expect fear. They get foresight." Riven shook his head, but pride was a bitter taste on his tongue. "You make this king look weak or wise," she said quietly. "Weakness would be reckless war. Strength is knowing when to hold back and listen." The beast inside him growled low, not in anger, but in contemplative unrest. He could feel its craving for dominance, for the raw power to assert control, but something deeper was awakening, a hunger for trust, fragile yet entire. Riven's hand brushed against hers, an anchor amid the shifting terrain of diplomacy and doubt. Quietly, the change began, yet, even as the fragile threads wove, darkness stirred among the pack itself. whispers that slipped through the stone walls like ice-cold daggers. Old fears and ambitions born again in secret meetings and shadowed glances. Riven and Alara had carved a precarious path between predator and prey, but betrayal brewed beneath. It came on a night thick with fog, the scent of rain lingering in the air. They had returned to the camp, a tentative peace, forged and sealed with blood and promises, only to find the barriers breached and the camp surrounded. There were no howls of the wild, welcoming them only silent shapes. Behind snarling teeth and glinting fangs, pack brothers turned enemies. The air was charged, crackling with the threat of destruction and broken trust. Riven's hand clenched into a fist. "Who among you?" His voice was a low growl, warning and fury wrapped tight as steel. Alara stood beside him, heart pounding, body tense but unwilling to yield. The scent in the air wasn't only fear, it was something far stranger charged, raw energy that hummed beneath her skin like a secret tune. From the swirling mist, a figure stepped forward. A trusted lieutenant, one who had once sworn loyalty but now bore a cruel smile. "The king is weak." The beast inside him falters. We wanted to see if the woman with no fear would crack. Alara's eyes blazed, the tribal scar on her cheek pulsing with a strange warmth. The power that had once seemed like a puzzle now surged through her, vivid and unrelenting. She felt it rise like wildfire through veins long parched, the hidden strength that no one had dared to see. Breath held too long finally escaped. "I do not fear," she said, voice low but resonant with something deeper than mere words. "And I will not break." Her hands rose before her, steady and commanding, palms open to the crowd. The air around her shimmered alive with a force that bent the moment. The betrayal flashed like lightning, surprise warping the faces of the traitors who had counted on fear and fragility. Riven stared, frozen at first, as the power radiated outward, not the brutal force of domination, but something entirely different. A pulse of energy that tamed, that shifted rage into wonder, that cracked open the frozen walls around the Alpha's heart. The pack's snarls faltered, the circle of aggression eased into an almost reverent silence. Even those who would have leapt and torn now lowered their weapons, eyes wide with cautious awe. "You wield something I never imagined," Riven murmured, stepping closer. The beast within him quieting like a storm, stilled by an unshakable calm. "How did you?" Alara shook her head slowly, the warmth still coursing through her, binding her to this land and these twisted loyalties. "I don't know yet, but I intend to learn." The traitors backed silently away as the power between them shifted from threat to an unspoken promise. The walls Riven had built inside himself, around his heart, his pack, his reign, began to crumble brick by brick under the weight of something older and far more profound than strength or fear. Together they stood, two fractured souls tempered by fire and fury, no longer alone against the darkness, but united in a new light. The beast inside the Alpha howled once more, but this time it carried not the cry of conquest or despair, but the echo of a dawn reborn. The night air was thick with tension in the clearing, beyond the ancient stone circle, where the surviving pack had gathered after the ambush. Every scarred face and wary eye bore the weight of loss and betrayal, yet beneath it all, a new current pulsed, sharp, electric, and impossible to ignore. Riven stood tall at the clearing's center, his raven-black hair caught by the restless wind, the jagged scar on his neck catching glimmers of moonlight. His piercing ice-blue eyes searched the crowd with steady resolve. The fierce beast within still rumbling low, but tethered to flesh and bone by something far stronger now. Talara stood beside him, her long dark chestnut hair falling in wild waves, just as unpredictable as the power simmering within her veins. The faint silver streaks that had been a quiet emblem of her mysterious strength caught the starlight like whispers of forgotten magic. Her deep amber eyes, sharp and luminous, swept across the assembled pack. Those who had once turned their backs on her now stood uncertain, caught between the old rules and the undeniable shift in their alpha's heart. The faint tribal scar that traced a jagged line across her left cheek was no mark of shame, but of survival, of battles won and scars earned. Tonight, it would become a symbol of a new era. Riven's voice cut through the cold night, steady and commanding as thunder rolling over mountains. "Pack," he called, his tone heavy with authority and something unspoken brewing beneath the surface. "These nights have been brutal, our bond tested by fire and treachery. Yet here we stand, not broken, but reborn." A murmur passed through the crowd, restless but captive. The Alpha's words were fire and balm all at once, a challenge to tradition, a promise of something different. "I have seen many things in my rule," Riven continued, stepping closer to Alara, placing a hand on the line of her shoulder, grounding both of them in the moment. "And I have come to understand that strength comes not from fear or dominance, but from trust, from choice." His gaze locked with hers for a heartbeat, an electric spark passing silently between them before he faced the pack once more. "Alara is not like the others. She has no fear of the beast that dwells within this pack, no desire to bend or be broken. She is immune to our power, not because she is weak, but because she is stronger than any of us." The statement hung heavy, like a blade cutting through thick night air. Whispers began to tumble over one another. Old rivals who had long seen Alara as nothing more than a fragile exile, scoffing behind hands, while allies held their breath. "I name her now, openly and without reservation, as my chosen mate," Riven declared, voice ringing clear and unyielding. "Together we will build a pack stronger than any that came before, one forged in fire, tempered by loyalty and bound by love." An eruption of howls followed, deep and haunting, carrying into the night sky like a call to the wild itself. The old laws creaked and groaned under the weight of that primal declaration, but the pack's wolves, their beasts roaring from the depths of their soul, answered in unison. Howls, layered and echoed, raw